cloud. Okay, so we are now live. Hello, everybody. We are just waiting as you all get into the room, so do just bear with us. We're just letting that number go up and then settle, and then we will start. I think we do have quite a few of you joining us today, so you will just have to be patient while that number settles. Oh, wow, there's a lot of you joining us today. That's fantastic. Do let us know where you are coming from today. It's always good to know who we've got with us. Okay, fantastic. So I think that number has now settled for us, which is great. So we can start the session. So good afternoon. Thank you to everyone who is joining us today. It is great to have you with us. This webinar is part of the programme for PLASA Online 2021 and is being presented by the Association of British Theatre Technicians. My name is Alicia Moore. I'm the ABTT's Association Coordinator, and we're very pleased to have collaborated with the webinars throughout all 4 days for PLASA Online. Today, I will be introducing our speakers and helping them to answer as many of your questions as possible. But just before that, some reminders about the arrangements for this afternoon. As with all the other Zoom webinars, we do recommend selecting the gallery view so that you can see all the panelists at the same time. This button can be found in the top right corner of your screen. We do not have live closed caption subtitles this afternoon, but a recording of this session will be posted on the ABTT website, and there will be closed caption subtitles available simply by clicking the CC button. You may use the chat function in this webinar today to talk amongst yourselves and of course with me. The chat button can be found on the bar at the bottom of your screen, and I shall be looking after this today, and I will say hello to you all in the chat in just a moment. It would be great if you could let us know where you are all joining us from today, and please do remember to select all panelists and speakers, attendees on the bottom to make sure we can see what you are all saying. Do feel free to chat with one another and give your thoughts throughout the event. We're always pleased to hear from you. I'll also be using this to post any useful links and information in the chat throughout the webinar as well. Just so that you know, we are going to be using the screen share function today. When we do this, the screen will reorganize itself to display the shared visual content, but it will return to the previous screen when the sharing stops, so you won't need to do anything. Most importantly, this session gives us an opportunity to address your questions. So if at any time during the webinar you do have a question, do just pop that into the Q&A tab. This is separate to the chat box, so do have a look at the bottom of your screen and there will be a little box that says Q&A, and do just pop your questions in there as you think of them, and we'll make sure we can get through them all. As mentioned, today's webinar is going to be recorded, and the recording will be available on the ABTT website, along with all the relevant information after the event. I now have the pleasure to introduce our speakers. So I'm very pleased to introduce Mark White. Mark is a past chairman of the ABTT, an ABTT fellow, and he currently chairs the ABTT's Communications and Publications Committee, and he's a member of the Editorial Standing Committee for Technical Standards. A very busy bee, clearly. We also have Robin with us today. Robin is the ABTT's Chief Executive, and he's also a member of the Editorial Standing Committee for Technical Standards. We're also hoping to have James Eade joining us partway through the session. James has kindly agreed to join us today to lurk in the background and help answer any questions that you might have as well. James is the author of the all-new 5th edition of the IET's Code of Practice for in-service inspection and testing of electrical equipment, as well as the Practitioner's Guide to Temporary Power Systems. And I will be posting links to both of these shortly in the chat box for your convenience. I will now hand over to Robin so that he can start the seminar.
Thank you very much, Alicia. It's very good to be here. And thank you to everybody who's joined. Fantastic numbers, still going up a little bit. So we should get on because there have been a huge number of updates in technical standards since we were last able to present a session such as this. To start with, I'm going to share my screen just to run through an overview of what those have been, and for anyone new to technical standards to give the briefest of introductions. So hopefully you're all now seeing that. And if I just move on. Yes, good. We're here and doing the right thing. So very quickly, the ABTT produces a code of practice for the theatre industry in the United Kingdom with the support of the National Theatre Safety Committee. And there are 11 members of the committee represented here by their logos. As part of that code of practice, and very much in the tradition of this wonderful guidance document, Manual of Safety Requirements in Theatres and Other Places of Public Entertainment, which was issued by the Home Office in 1934, the ABTT, together with 4 other publishing partners, publishes technical standards for places of entertainment, currently with the date 2015 in the top right-hand corner. It's acknowledged and recognised by the HSE, both as being part of an established standard for our industry and also specifically in its own right. The last printed edition, which captured all the amendments, updates and revisions to that point, was issued in July 2020. And for those of you who have hard copies at home and want to check which one you have, if you look at the bottom of page 4, you will see the publication history, and the most up-to-date hard copy ends with the date 1st of July 2020. A quick reminder, though, that the most up-to-date versions will be the online version. When you purchase a copy of Tech Standards, you get a unique serial number by which you can request a link to the online edition so that you can be certain to have access to the most recent updates at any particular time. So what's been happening? Oh, and if you want more information about updates, we do publish a commentary on what's changed in Sightline, the ABTT's quarterly journal, where you'll find the regular technical standards update column. So what's been changing? In the most recent hard copy, we've captured significant amendments to sections B9, F1, F2 and M1, identified on the screen for you. But remember, they will not be amendments exclusively in those sections. There are always other updates going on, particularly to section A4 references, where changes in all the referenced guidance documents that are included in Tech Standards are contained, and as those reference and guidance documents change and are themselves revised, therefore the references in Technical Standards are revised. And also we corrected a glaring error in section D1 on stability. So as an example of what happens in A4 references, here's one of many tens and tens of updates in the most recent amendments. But here we can see that 2 new British standards titles, both of which were BSEN IEC documents, were added into the references. And furthermore, another example of another British standard document being included. Section B9, conservation of energy. There have been multiple amendments in this section, and we have tried to even further integrate the discussion of sustainable energy use throughout the text standards. A lot of this gets included in the commentary, and as those of you who are regular users will know, each section starts with a commentary that sets out the overarching principles, and then there are individually referenced recommendations on how to meet those principles. A lot of the amendments that have taken place do appear in the commentary sections, and it is always important to read the commentary as well as the recommendations to gain a full understanding of the intent of the standards and how they seek to achieve compliance. But here you can see an example of a reference to guidance, and of course one of the main drivers of the most recent set of amendments has been alignment with the 2018 edition, the 18th edition of BS 7671 requirements for electrical installations, the IET wiring regulations. Also in B9, we discuss the response to climate emergency and the statutory requirements to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, there have been significant legislative changes as the UK government has ratcheted up the targets for the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Conservation of energy features, and obviously we are now looking at light sources that give much better efficacy, but there are some considerations to be aware of. Data logging for half-hourly measurements can be very important to achieving an understanding and therefore the ability to manage energy use, and we cover that in B9. There's also further information about electrical installations, which, although the reference here is waste management, it was inserted immediately before waste management under a new title of electrical installations, which is why there's a slight peculiarity in the reference there. So I mentioned in the introduction that there was a significant amendment in section D1. This is about the rigidity of structures, and it was a correction of an error. And obviously it's taken from the appropriate approved documents that support the building regulations, but it now aligns with those and provides some good advice as well. We now come on to section F1, electrical installation, and this is an area that Mark has been very involved with through his work both with the ABTT, his work with the Standing Committee for Technical Standards, and also his work with the IET in supporting some of the publications that they produce to provide guidance on meeting the requirements of BS 7671. So I'm going to hand over to Mark now and let him speak to these slides and also tell me when he wants the next one. So I'll move on to this one.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you, Alicia, and thank you to all our sponsors today for making all this happen. It's been a lot of emphasis on RCDs for last 10 years at least, and to the point where the various sort of regulations requirements change, so that we say currently say in F1 that we assume it's going to become damage in use. We assume that it's going to require inspection and testing every so often, and that all the sockets on the stage up to 32 amps shall be protected by RCDs. Now, the issue with RCDs and particularly on 32 amp supplies, is that they're good for 30 milliamps, and which means that you can very easily overload these circuits, even though they're 32 amps in total. They are, in fact, we're still measuring fairly low earth leakage currents. Now, earth leakage currents are everywhere today in theatre equipment. Moving lights, for example, video walls, and well, just about everything that we plug in these days into our electrical supply. So whilst it says, and what we say is that, yes, indeed, you do have to have RCDs on each circuit. It's each final circuit. So while we may use 32 amps as a distribution unit fed off in the usual way of what we call the temporary power, 7909, 7909 makes an emphasis on using 30 milliamp RCDs on each final circuit. So whilst it may be that the 32 amp outlet on your stage is protected by an RCD, it may not necessarily be so, and you are relying on the final circuits. Otherwise, plug in 6 or more LEDs into your one circuit, each of which is drawing, say, 140 watts, and suddenly you discover that your big 32 amp supply goes off because of this phenomenon of earth leakage. They have to have them. It's part of EMC regulations, and that it must be. We end up. We've got to be careful here that we don't end up with unwanted tripping. Just as we keep saying at all these sessions, there's no such thing as nuisance tripping. Those of us who've been on these boards will know that the IET and others say it is not nuisance tripping. It means there is a fault of some sort has happened. So it's known as unwanted tripping. And so although we do mention this, we have to be careful. And that's exactly the purpose of technical standards for places of entertainment. It doesn't just recite the various standards and the things that you have to achieve. It is giving us practical advice. It's part of a code of practice. Robin, can we go to the next slide, please?
Certainly.
Now, this is to do with flexible cables. This comes up an enormous amount very often. And basically, we say that in this case, that every flexible extension cable on a stage should have a minimum, in fact, a cross-sectional area of 2.5 millimeters squared. So we're simply saying that for various reasons, 1.5 millimeters squared 3-core cable is not enough, and 1 millimeter is definitely not enough. It's to do with maintaining something called earth loop impedances, particularly over the sort of lengths of cable that we typically find on stages. It's made slightly better now if we've got lesser powered dimmers or relay units, but the simple practice is that it must be 2.5 millimeter, and it should be H05 RNF for interior use cable. It's a tough rubber cable. H07 RNF for the is signed in. Am I still alive?
Yes, we can still see and hear you, but you've lost technical standards.
Oh, have I?
And I would just say that those two cable references are included in the amendments, and it was just for a matter of space and alacrity that I didn't also include those specific amendments in this slide pack, which will be available with the recording.
Okay, thank you. Right, we got up to this point here where there is, must be sufficient mechanical strength, and you can comply with that by using H05 RNF, for example. Robin, what have we got next? Again, it's the same issue, so that we have to ensure there is sufficient mechanical protection for all equipment. that's particularly electrical equipment, and that and it goes back to our very old systems of wiring. So we always used to insist, and still do, on wiring systems in the stage house in particular to be sufficiently mechanically protected. And yes, it's now the protective bonding. And again, as those of you familiar with 7671 will know that there's various changes in the nomenclature for bonding. We're still trying to maintain an earth equipotential bonding zone for all of our equipment, but some of this basically says that there is these days, and we'll go back, we're about to appear, this is the second section, where we talk about the old days of having technical earths. Well, the old days of technical earths have gone. And so, and this was always to do with those of you familiar with analog equipment, because you could set up earth loop hums and various other things as well. And so you used to have everything to be going back for a separate earthing system, back to the main earthing conductor. And these were often, the technical earths were in cream cable. Now our wiring regulations have changed and we can't do that anymore. And so the best practice for this is to use the same sort of earthing that we use in IT equipment, which basically means everything is solidly earthed as it needs to be. This is what's going to happen anyway. Now that we're moving so quickly into digital sound, it's going to be much less of a problem. But for those places still left with analog sound systems, I'm afraid it's now getting to the point where you have to do something else about it to comply with the current set of regulations and requirements. I'm sure there'll be questions about that. There usually is. Robin, what's our next one? Yes, this is this whole point about clean earth distribution we've just said, not no longer, no more. Robin? Yeah, again, this is all to do with clean earths. And this was probably one of our more radical changes, because we resisted doing this for many years, because we knew that there were particularly sound systems that relied on this in order to provide clean sound. Robin? And so basically, it's so the structural elements of a building are have to be considered these days in terms of earthing of structures and buildings and parts thereof. This is particularly true for protecting multiple earthing and earth neutrals, protective earth neutrals and the like. We get extremely interested in what are called dropped neutrals, disconnected neutrals. And part of this is to do with making sure the structure of the building is adequately earthed. Okay, Robin, what's now? We might come onto this one a little later, I think. And basically, because this is, and I wouldn't mind if James Eade does show up. I wouldn't mind his.
He is just literally
perfect timing.
Sorry about that.
Speak of someone and he shall appear. So perhaps if we could come back to this one, please, for arc fault detection devices and also surge protection devices, please, James.
Super. So
about how we're going to talk about that. Right. So shall we move on to section F2? Robin, are you going to talk to us about?
Yep, certainly. Here, yep. So section F2, lighting, including emergency lighting. There were a number of amendments. Obviously, new light sources also available now for emergency lighting. But we must remember the aesthetic requirements of our particular circumstances. We have color rendering requirements and we have dimming requirements that many audiences will find essential to the quality of the experience they have in a place of entertainment. There are some new considerations with the new technologies to take into account to ensure those expectations are met. In the commentary here, we discuss those issues and recommend that they're taken into consideration at an early phase. And there's much more on that subject throughout section F2, but the essence is to make sure that you understand the color rendering properties of the sources you're using, even though you can now select sources for much better efficacy and much lower power consumption, and that you also make sure that your expectations for dimming can be met. There are also some practical and pragmatic provisions. For instance, the discussion of having control gear for standby and emergency lighting located at a remote location to the light source itself, so that enclosures can be located behind walls or suitably concealed in the interior decor and structure of buildings without having to have very large equipment boxes at the location of the light source or the exit sign. And then, as you might imagine, if we are undertaking significant revisions in section F, looking at the electrical installation and the subsequent parts thereof, and also in B9, there will be a natural corollary in section M1 on certification. And just sort of one slide here to illustrate how that follows through, although there are many more examples. This is obviously about providing certification for the electrical installation in a place of entertainment and the need for a competent signatory on that inspection, in that inspection process, and the guidance available for that. James,
Robin, should we just go back to emergency lighting, because that's we get quite a few questions about that these days.
Yeah.
The questions that we're being asked: do I still have to have my central battery system, or can I go to many fittings, each with their own batteries in them? And the answer is, for our purposes, is that we prefer that you indeed do keep central battery systems for a number of reasons. The first one is, even as the emergency lighting industry has admitted to itself at least, is that a dear old self-contained emergency lighting system is not particularly reliable. And it was particularly true when they were fitted with nickel-cadmium batteries and with very simple chargers that basically over time cooked the batteries within the unit, and they didn't work for very long, if at all, when the power was removed from them. Now that there's more sophisticated batteries and a new set of nickel ions and most other sorts of devices in local emergency lighting units, it's less of a problem. However, it left us with a legacy of real issues. Now, just to explain how emergency lighting always used to work, or supposed to work rather, they had a central battery system. And in all of the critical areas in the building, in the escape path of getting people out, there were always two things. First of all, two sets of supplies, one of which came from the battery, the other one came from the normal mains. And they were interleaved along the auditorium and also in all of the escape paths, so that if one system of power should fail, then they wouldn't be left in complete darkness. So there'll always be some method, and they have to be illuminated for something like 3 hours and provide good illumination to do that. So that's why we had quite complex emergency lighting systems. And the advantage in those, of course, were that they were immediately obvious if any of the lamps were out. And it was a relatively simple way of testing the whole thing by simply turning off the normal mains and seeing for how long and how bright the escape paths were within the building. Now, obviously, that's not the same with, it's a much more complex process to test individual light fittings with individual batteries in them. So in one sense, for maintenance of escape routes lighting, we still think that central battery systems are better. If not, there does have to be a system in place where they're tested. And most people know that your emergency lighting system has to be tested every 3 months and a certificate produced accordingly. So that's the sort of update, if you like, on much the same really for emergency lighting systems. Robin.
I just wondered if we should return to arc detection. There we go. And also the surge protection devices. If James has had a moment to focus his thoughts on those subjects.
Yeah, now the arc fault detection devices was a new introduction, as many know, into the wiring regulations. And traditionally, there's generally a phased approach. So 30 milliamp RCDs, as some might remember, were at first a recommendation, then they became recommended in certain situations. And over successive amendments and additions of BS 7671, it gets a bit stricter each time. And people are quite comfortable with that. Well, with arc fault detection devices, they were recommended in, obvious locations like a combustible or buildings with combustible high fire loading, places with sleeping accommodation and similar. And it was a recommendation. And then the proposal in Amendment 2, which went out for public comment earlier this year and is now being worked through, introduced a very similar requirement to that for RCDs, and that any circuit under 32 amps should have an AFD on it. And that garnered a lot of comments, as you can imagine, in the draft for public comment process. It is currently being worked through, and the jury's still a bit out on what form the new wording is going to take. As you can imagine, there's been a lot of resistance to what would be a basic shift from a recommendation to an almost blanket application. The cost would be incredible. In a new installation, like a domestic property, for example, it's quite manageable and doable. But we're then into that difficulty of saying, well, if we've got a load of temporary distribution equipment, when I assemble that on my tour at a new venue, as soon as the new regulations come into force, they will require the arc fault detection device. So we'll have to wait and see how that pans out. The comments are being finalised at the moment with a view to the new edition coming out later in the year. So I'll be able to give everyone an update on a more concrete update on where that's heading nearer the time. But like all these things, and what many people don't realise with the wiring regulations is that the designer has the opportunity and the prerogative to look at the recommendations or the requirements of BS 7671 and apply some engineering design ingenuity to it. Say, well, look, that doesn't apply in my situation because I understand the technical intent of that regulation is to save lives in a building that has sleeping accommodation above it. But if the risk in a particular environment is low, like an event, for example, it's a managed system. Everyone's there while it's on. You turn it off when you go home at night. So if there are any latent faults that an AFD would detect, they'll be detected anyway, because you'll see the cable smoking at the back of the stage, for example, during the show. So it's not unreasonable to take a pragmatic view on the implementation of such devices. So in terms of the surge protection devices, again, in the last edition, the 18th edition, that was basically introduced where any situation, pretty much all we do, where you've got a large number of co-located people, where there's a building of historic interest, etc. We ticked most of the boxes where surge protection is necessary. Again, it's always worth, rather than focusing on individual regulations, to understand what the scope of the section that regulation is in. And surge protection is for protection against transient overvoltages from atmospheric sources, i.e. lightning, or switching surges within an installation. So for a lot of temporary events, the generator fed ones, for example, they're not susceptible to lightning strikes, so SPDs wouldn't really be necessary. In terms of retrofitting them to buildings, again, there's no requirement to retrofit your building with safety devices to bring them up to speed with current regulations, and that's made clear in the introduction. So for a lot of venues, it's only the new builds that SPDs would be really affected by, or sorry, would be affected by the SPD requirement. And given the way power quality is moving, they're not a bad idea. But I don't know of many installations where there's been a lot of failures of equipment caused by bad power. Coupled with that, just in terms of Amendment 2, that section is changing. So we will see what is effectively a relaxation on that application for our industry. So the wording around where SPDs are actually required has been reduced to situations where they are quite critical, and it's again designers' prerogative to design their system accordingly and decide if they think that the installation warrants SPDs or not. So that's where we're at with those two. Was there anything else? And apologies everyone for joining late. I've been tied up in meetings all day, so I've been overrunning.
We're very pleased to have you, James. There's a couple of questions about AFDDs, so maybe we should go on to those. So does a AFDD have to go onto a final circuit, or can it protect several circuits?
No, it can protect several circuits. Remember the fundamental principles, though, you need to ensure division of the installation so that operation of a protective device doesn't affect other users. So if you wouldn't put the AFD on the origin of an installation, because if a mouse chews through a cable in the basement, you lose the whole building. So you'd still need to exercise that diversity, if you like, of where you put them. But otherwise, no, they can go anywhere. Sorry, I hope it's not too noisy. I'm going to shut the window if it is.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
And then are there testers available in the market to test AFDDs? So if we do roll them out to distros, we're able to test and maintain them like we do with RCDs and and a multifunction tester.
No, and we're not likely to see that either, because effectively what you've got to do is simulate an arc. The way these devices work is they look at the characteristic signature of an arcing current waveform, and there's quite a lot of mathematical processing that goes on. So in order to test an AFD, you really have to recreate an arc in a system, which is of course a bit of test equipment to be able to do repeatedly and reliably each time is going to be quite a challenge. So we won't see any test instruments being able to do that. So it'll be very much a question of just pressing the test button on the front and making sure that it operates when you press it.
Very good. Maybe we should go on to temporary power and BS 7909. With temporary power and BS 7909, with fixed sockets in the venue, do you see the circuits on the dimmers as the final circuit or the dimmer unit feed as a final circuit? So does the RCD need to sit before the dimmer or on the output circuit of the dimmer? And should we start looking at replacing dimmer racks if they are only protected by an MCB leading to the final socket onto the fixture?
Can I answer that question, seeing as that was a very common question in a previous life of mine? And the answer is that you need an RCD on the final circuit of each dimmer. It's also much better if the RCD is at the dimmer end, not at the load end. Sometimes they do not work. And it's been a vexed question for a very long time. What we say at this moment, and we considered this during these amendments to F1, was that we say at the moment that you can have them on the incoming side, 30 milliamp RCD on the incoming side, do up to 6 dimmers, up to 6 dimmer pack. And that will be fine. But it is, as James has just been describing, and that is that you don't get a lot of what's called selection these days. It used to be called discrimination, but we're not allowed to use that anymore. And so the selection simply says, as James says, if you've got something on the main incoming side that's protecting everything, you'll lose everything. And if it's tripped, and there's so many things these days are in fact creating these large amounts of earth leakage currents, which all add up. So it's best to maintain discreetly. There is another part to this, and that is, can you use a socket outlet with RCD protection built into it? And the answer is to that question, that's a standard 7671 question. And that is, if you look up 7671, you'll see that they are not allowed. They are not allowed to be used for that very purpose, because most of them do not have the required braking capacity to still work as overcurrent device in this sense, or the ability to break an arc. So I'm afraid that the answer is you've got to have them on the final dimmer side of the load, on the load side of the dimmer, more accurately.
Yeah, to add a bit to that, I mean, in the wiring regs, the definition of a final circuit is a circuit to which an item of current using equipment is going to be connected, like a lamp or similar. But you know, the RCD obviously won't work on the dimmed circuit, so it has to be, as Mark says, on the end of the cable feeding the dimmer. A couple of other points on the message. Do you need to replace dimmer racks? No, you don't. There's no, in the wiring regulations in the introduction, it says installations conforming to previous editions of BS 7671 are not necessarily unsafe, as long as they're obviously maintained, etc. And there's no need to retrofit protective devices to bring them up to current standards. And again, that's a big misnomer. As long as your installation is maintained and looked after, it doesn't necessarily become unsafe. Yes, you might want to add RCDs and so on circuits, because they do provide better protection for the user. But in a properly designed installation that's maintained, strictly speaking, there's no need to upgrade anything. So, you know, I'm sure the dimmer people would love me to say, yeah, you need to replace your dimmers, but no, you don't.
Thanks. And actually, Mark and James are the perfect people, perhaps. We passed over it quite quickly, but before we go to any more questions, we did just mark the fact that there's a new IET code of practice for in-service inspection and testing. And obviously we refer to that. That's one of the amendments that's been captured, the reference to that. So it might be a good opportunity to just talk a little bit more now about the demise of PAT and the rise of in-service inspection and testing.
Can I just preempt James a little here? And I'm more likely to be far more appreciative of James' creation. It is this book here, which is the 5th edition of in-service inspection and testing of electrical equipment. So I'll obviously let James talk about it, seeing it's his book, but basically this is trying to deal with the problem of PAT and portable appliance testing, which of course became known as PAT testing, which was portable appliance testing. a number of questions came out of this. What's portable? So it got to be various definitions, that be more than 25 kilos or take 2 people to lift it, and a dog. And what's an appliance? Well, the only definition truly of an appliance is a washing machine or something like it, a household appliance. And of course, we meant it to mean things such as hair dryers and everything else, electric drills that we go and plug into these things. Now, part of the ABTT has had its own, had 2 versions or 2 editions of its own testing of electrical equipment, and then the PAT had such a very bad name in terms of it being done unnecessarily. In the Lustock report into the health and safety legislation and executive, one of the things it said back in 2017 was that this portable appliance testing shouldn't be done at fixed intervals. It always should be done on a risk assessment basis to describe whether or not something does need testing or not. So if we looked at 4-way blocks, they exist, we don't like them, under somebody's desk in an office that's running their PC, a couple of monitors, perhaps phone system, and various other things that they'll have about the place. And all it does is sit under there year after year. Do you really have to test it every 5 years? Protected by 13-amp fuse or whatever? The answer was no, not really. And so it started to say that, well, maybe the maximum testing interval should be 5 years, but it was all that bit. Now, herein lies the issue for us. And that is to say that in our previous editions, we'd canvassed the opinion of various people as to whether or not we should be nominating the intervals between testing. And yes, we had this list. So when the ABTT got involved, thank you, James,
you had a good presence on the committee.
We did have a very
wasn't by accident.
Committee. They were great fun, those meetings, and I learned an enormous amount. We basically said that we were going to adopt this code of practice as our own, as such, to save us reinventing the wheel. And so it's a very, very good book, and it deals with all sorts of things that we didn't deal with before, such as, do you test hand dryers in toilets? Do you check sound equipment racks? Do you look at computer servers and other such things? And it's all in the book. Now, it was not before. James, would you like to tell us why you done it?
Yeah, no, it does have my fingerprints over up.
About 2 years, James.
The basically with the code of practice, it came about some years ago because the IET were asked by the HSE to look at electrical maintenance, because the wiring regulations covers a fixed installation, and there was this acknowledgement that with the introduction of the electricity at work regulations in 1989, there was a scope gap, if you like, for maintenance of electrical equipment. And so the original code of practice came about, and at the time, you know, in terms of building a committee, there was representatives from manufacturers on there, and the manufacturer said, well, look, you know, this is the tests we do, or these are the tests we do on a product before it leaves a factory for product standard safety compliance testing, and that formed the bedrock of the inspection and testing process. And of course, everyone said, well, how often should we do this? So they put the table in to give you an idea of frequencies. And so, you know, from that, the code of practice developed. And what I did with this edition was to try and rewind back to the original objective, was to say, well, look, you know, it's an established industry now. And there was, as Mark said, that issue about, well, an appliance technically is a domestic appliance like a hairdryer or a washing machine. So, you know, that doesn't include a Source 4. It doesn't include a Yamaha mixing desk, you know. So the focus has been very much on electrical equipment, which is, you know, equipment connected to the installation. So what we try to do, and, you know, very much with the help of the committee as well. So I'm truly grateful for the support the ABTT have given, and some other people from our industry as well. So what we try to do is to say, look, you've got the electrical installation. The electrical installation gets periodically checked by your facilities company, or you might do it. What about all the kit connected to it? Now, that could be an air conditioning unit, as Mark said, the hand dryer in the toilet, because the people doing the electrical installation will look at those things and say, oh, that's on a fuse spur, that's on an isolator, that's permanently bolted into the wall. So, it's they won't test it because it's not part of the installation. And then, of course, the guys doing the old pat testing would come along and say, oh, that hasn't got a plug on it. That's part of the installation. And so all these things would fall through the gap. And so the idea behind the book was to say, well, okay, think of all the equipment in the installation and come up with some sort of maintenance regime. When we came to the table on the frequencies, you're trying to do a one-size-fits-all table. And bear in mind, this code of practice applies to you and a theatre. It applies to a rental company providing kit. We made the obligations on rental companies very clear. It applies to the office I'm in at the moment. It applies to a hospital, a factory, workshops. There's so many different environments, and each one is different. A factory or a workshop unit in an industrial estate, one of them might be doing metal bashing and have extension leads being dragged around the floor. The next one might be doing, I don't know, carpentry or something, or a lot less dangerous or damaging to the loose equipment. So just because they're both factory units doesn't mean you'd expect the appliances all at the same time. So for that reason, we focus much more on risk assessment and tried to divorce people away from this periodic, oh, you've got to do it every year because that's what the guidance says. And that was just people pigeonholing themselves into a row at a table because they didn't know where else they sat. So we've really given examples of risk assessments and, tried to solve some perennial questions. What do I do with my amp rack at the side of stage that doesn't get moved, doesn't get touched from one year to the next? Do I have to take every appliance out, test it individually, put it back in? Well, no, because you're more likely to damage the wiring in the back by sliding them in and out all the time than by leaving them alone. Treat it as an appliance. So there's a whole appendix on guidance for racks and bays and assemblers of electrical equipment like that, if you like. So yeah, we've basically gone to town on it, really. So it's quite a different beast, but yeah, we're very much trying to divorce people away from the concept of portable appliance testing, because it's embedded with this historic, got to do it every year, and not really encouraging people to think about the risk that the equipment they have is exposed to. So it's very much given the user or the duty holders responsible for the equipment the ability to say, well, here's my risk assessment. I'm making a reasoned judgment that 3 years is fine. Great. Who's going to argue with that? To the best of my knowledge, no one's been prosecuted for not testing their kit every year, but they have been prosecuted for not having a coherent, thought through risk assessment and method statements for the work that they're doing. So the like I say, the risk assessment, there's examples in the back as well to help people sort of think about environment, users, protection in the installation, and all sorts of aspects that can be used to inform a risk assessment itself. So
can I just perhaps say that, James, we're rapidly running out of time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll talk to you.
No. But just simply to say that one of our attendees here today, Chris Hooley,
hello, Chris.
Very regular attender at the many meetings that it took to write this book. I think it took as many meetings as there are pages, which was 104, to get this particular book out. Should we deal with any of the questions?
Yeah. Shall I? Does anyone want to refer to any text, or shall I take sharing off so people can see us slightly more large? Yes, why not? So we've got a couple of follow-up questions about RCDs. If you have an old dimmer that's then connected to new outlets, would it be good practice to include an RCD in that upgrade? And then there's a supplementary question, which is, does this include existing installations such as LD90s?
If you change the circuits, that's a modification to an installation. So that new part of the installation has to comply. So probably yes.
Thank you. That's good.
A practical part to that would be, do you need to include a supplementary rack in the ways that you used to have patch panels and the like, could you fit RCDs relatively close to the dimmers themselves and on the outgoing circuits? Would that work for you, James?
Sorry, I misunderstood that question. Say again.
Okay,
so
fine. You've got an LD90, which it's impossible to put RCBOs into, for example.
Yeah.
Now, how about if you put a box beside it somewhere that used to be a marshalling cabinet or something like that, and you put a load of RCBOs or RCDs in there? Would that satisfy the requirement?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because at the end of the day, what you're trying to achieve is protection for the user in that part of the installation. So when someone's hanging off the top of their tall escape and trap a cable under a hook clamp or something, you've got effective protection. So it doesn't really matter where it is, in that respect. But the fact that the protection is there is the key thing. So it is possible to protect old LD90s and similar.
Thanks. So going back to in-service inspection and testing, accepting venues are all different. Is there a template risk assessment available to help a move from yearly portable appliance testing to a more risk assessed based inspection system?
There are example risk assessments in the back of the code of practice.
Excellent.
But unfortunately not in a theatre context, because what you've got to remember is the readership of that code of practice is very broad. So we had to temper our theatrical aspirations a little in the content we'd like. That's not to say that we couldn't easily create a bespoke theatre-based one quite easily, I think, using the same format and same template.
Probably a task to take away for us to do. Thank you very much, Jim, for the question. It's provoked a good action point. Moving swiftly on, because we do have questions. Do motor or hoist controllers need some form of RCD protection running off a 32 amp three-phase neutral and earth supply?
Okay, the answer is we've been through this one a number of times. And the real problem here is that if you've got a chain hoist controller, pretty much all of them, the commercial ones and even the home-built ones, just run straight MCBs for each motor. And should we be in fact having RCDs? The answer is that the RCD may, if it's unwantingly tripped, may in fact create a problem whereby you've suddenly lost one out of your four hoists and you'll bend something out of shape. So the answer is that because your risk assessment will say that these cables are in view all of the time, and that you've got trained personnel using these things, that no, you don't do it because it may introduce a safety hazard. It's the same thing with putting fuses into big magnets that pick up old broken cars and scrap metal and the like.
So we've got a minute for the next question, if we could be swift, and then one question to follow. So do the panel feel that newcomers to the theatre and events industry, coming from higher education, for instance, should be taught about BS 7909 and should be encouraged to complete a course on the 18th edition?
It's a very unfair question. You've got an ex-chairman and the current chairman of BS 7909 talking to you now. Next question.
Let me quickly qualify that. I think the not specifically 7909. I think entrants should definitely be given some electrical safety awareness training, but I wouldn't recommend the 18th edition because that's an update course. It's CPD for those who are already qualified electricians, and a lot of people think it's a qualification in itself, and it isn't. It's just an update. This is what's changed since last time. So.
Thank you. And James has just, I don't know who James is, but James has just reminded everybody that the HSE website does have model risk assessments that are easy to copy and modify and are a good starting point. And then probably our last question, because we're already on the hour, will there be a closer tie-up between the Green Book and the Yellow Book in the future? So the Theatre Green Book is a project that's been led by the Theatres Trust and the ABTT, together with Borough Happold's sustainability division, looking at providing guidance, and the idea was to provide guidance on reducing energy use and carbon footprint in the same way that the technical standards provides guidance on safety and compliance. So that's the parallel between the two projects. The Theatre Green Book project hopes to publish 3 volumes. The first to provide guidance on sustainable productions, the second guidance on sustainable buildings, and the third guidance on sustainable operation, all in the theatre live performance context. The first volume on sustainable productions is available. It's available in beta version, but an open source. It can be downloaded. I'm sure Alicia will put the link into the chat. And people are being encouraged, and we would welcome everybody, no matter how much or how little they can try out parts of the guidance, to have a go and to provide feedback about what works, what they think would be good solutions, what they'd like further support with. We hope that the guidance for buildings will be out probably in the next 6 weeks, again in beta form for people to trial and give feedback on, and then the final volume on operations should be available by the autumn. The question was, will there be a closer tie-up? There will obviously be a closer tie-up, and as soon as the Theatre Green Book documents have stabilised, we'll be looking to cross-reference between technical standards and the Green Book, and also from the Green Book towards technical standards where there are issues of safety and compliance to take into account. So thank you, Richard, for that question. And we've overrun by 2 minutes, but it just leaves me to thank James very much for joining us, a hot foot from his previous commitments. Thank you very much, Mark, for going into the detail of so many of those electrical updates that we've accommodated. And I shall say goodbye and thank Alicia and hand back to her in case she has anything that she needs to say before we disappear.
No, I think that's everything. I will be putting all the chat, so all the links from this session up onto the ABTT website shortly. So do just keep an eye out. We have all of our sessions recorded and available for free. So if you've missed anything or want to take any notes, do just take a look online. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me. Take care.